Welcome to the Thursday, January 31st edition of the Clemson Dubcast. Hope everybody out there is having a great week and staying warm. Good grief. It is frigid outside. Appreciate all the suggestions for future podcast guests. The subscribers at Tiger Illustrated had a conversation about that, an ongoing thread with lots of good suggestions, and trust me, I'm writing them down because I need all the help I can get. One of those, and actually this has been suggested before this week, is Paul Strelow, the famed recruiting extraordinaire for TigerIllustrated.com. I've been friends with him for, I think, going on 20 years now. And we work for the same website, but boy, do we have almost totally different jobs. I'm fascinated, and I know plenty of you are fascinated about how someone who does his job so well goes about that job and the mechanics behind it and earning trust of various folks and trying to sift through what's fact and fiction. And so looking forward to that conversation and bringing that to you. And thanks to the subscribers for taking such an interest in helping make the podcast better and bringing in some more good and interesting guests. Title sponsor of the Clemson Dubcast, Parham Smith and Archenhold Law Firm in Greenville. Very happy to have them aboard. Couldn't do it without them. Blake Smith and Brooke Archenhold, both Clemson grads, both huge fans. Forte of their firm is medical negligence. They represent patients and their family members in medical negligence actions. They also handle all sorts of other complex personal injury litigation. I can vouch for them. About 10 years ago, a family member had a pretty serious medical situation with one of the local hospitals. Went to Blake Smith, and he very quickly and authoritatively gave us some great advice, and we were very thankful for that. Parham Smith and Archenhold offers free consultations. Give them a call, 864-990-4581 or parhamlaw.com. All right, let's get to our conversation with Paul Strelow. Going to cover a lot of ground here. His background in the journalism industry and the recruiting coverage industry. Going to get into some of the backstory of the Justyn Ross acquisition by Clemson a year ago. Also going to get into some of the friction between the staffs at Clemson and South Carolina. Doesn't seem like old Dabo and Muschamp are huge fans of each other. So interested to hear what Paul's thoughts on that are. All right, here we go. Enjoy. Okay, for this week's podcast, we are going in-house with Paul Strelow. Paul, I'm sure that you're like, man, I had to deal with enough of Larry's crap in Santa Clara and Dallas, and now I got to sit there and talk to him again. So appreciate you taking the time to join me.
You can tell it's getting late for down your list when you finally reach back to me, particularly as boring as I am, as you experienced there in Santa Clara. But anyway, should be good.
All right, what is your schedule like here leading up to the do you call it the second signing day? Yeah, you call it the second signing day. What's your routine? Is there a routine?
Well, I think there isn't really necessarily a routine other than you're just kind of always on call and always digging for information. Now, the fact since the early signing day has come about, it's changed the dynamic for my professional life. Particularly covering Clemson, where Clemson's already signed 27 guys. Maybe they bring in 2 more, and we already have an idea of who they are. Going back a couple of years ago, at this time, I'm thinking back to the Isaiah Simmons, Kayvon Wallace, that class, even going before Trayvon Mullen. There's a lot more going on. There's more suspense coming into the final days. Not only, which guys will Clemson be able to get, but you're also keeping track of, okay, there are poachers out there, people trying to get the commitments off the team you covers list. Just who might be, might have any last second reservation or be, listening to somebody else. There was probably much more paranoia on my end of trying to dot all the I's and cross the T's and making sure what all's in place. Now everything, particularly when you add in the early signing day and when you add in Clemson just generally getting things done earlier and having the cachet to keep recruits without question, it's a lot more stable at this time of year. And it's more right now for me is tracking the elite junior day visitors, seeing what staying power and what traction those kids have with Clemson, and really, we haven't totally turned the page. There are one or two people you're still keeping an eye on, but it's really more looking ahead and seeing what wheels are in motion for the junior class as Clemson starts putting that together over the next probably, or from now on till the end of the summer.
It's really interesting how different our jobs are in that there aren't a lot of days of my year where, I go to bed or I enter the nighttime going, oh gosh, and there's still uncertainty about, what I'm going to write that day, or this could happen or that can happen. Of course, breaking news happens, at times and you have to, put everything on hold for that. But it seems like your model or your sort of profession, as it were, you're still gathering stuff into the night, and often you're a night owl, right? Like you do most of your work in the nighttime.
Yeah, it is as we both know, but maybe the listener might not know. You and I kind of followed the same career trajectory. I mean, we got to know each other back in 2000 when we first really were, the early years, newspaper wise. We were both kind of at the smaller and medium papers, both took the bigger jump up to higher place on the Clemson beat. And, we've been friends, throughout that process, and I've leaned on you for career advice. But generally, around 2011, I got out of the newspaper biz and moved over to the recruiting side, and I don't want to go back because what you do has significant challenges that I grew sick of. I think what people don't recognize is necessarily the mundaneness of the day-to-day press conferences and the challenges of getting unique and compelling content, out of homogenized, press settings. But that's probably another sidebar there. But where my schedule turned is, yes, now, particularly when you consider, high school athletes, whether they're playing football or have another sport or training, they're not accessible for the most part until, after their practices and dinner and whatnot in the evenings. And so to reach them requires those hours, 7 o'clock till 10 or whenever you feel comfortable dealing with prospects. So there's that component. But generally, just the news gathering industry has changed to where, as you know, with our message board, or the message board model is when people want instant reaction. And when things go down, you have to be able to respond to them, or you always have to be on call for the news. So that often leads to, a lot of kids put out offers and stuff late at night. The gathering process from not only the news gathering process, not only from prospects, but the people around them, your sources on the college side, on the high school side, the familial side with the prospects, that's really an all day, communication process. And so it never really turns off. So you wake up wondering, okay, is there anything else out there that I didn't account for? You're always kind of on the clock deal, as opposed to, at least you go back a decade ago, we could file our stories at late afternoon, evening, and unless really something went down, we could clock out for a night. There isn't really clocking out on my side, and that's part of the job. That's inherent in the job, but it's also something that I've probably worked into my schedule as well. And we have a large family, and we're all kind of here at home all the time. So I kind of push some work to later in the night once all kids are in bed, things of that nature.
Is it any harder now than it was in 2011 when you first started doing this, covering recruiting, to sift through the BS and to get a read, an accurate read or a diagnosis on a player's intentions, what he's really thinking?
Well, I think there's some degrees yes and some degrees no. I think from the yes part, just the industry in general having changed, you could go a number of years ago where, it was prospect interview after prospect interview. That's largely the content we churned out. And so, at least in my view, over time, a lot of that's just become noise. There's only, as the proliferation of that content has come out, you've got several networks like Rivals. You've got a number of, fanboy sites or free sites where people are calling the kids. It's hard for them to differentiate. They're getting 50 interview requests all the time. And so everything starts reading the same. They're more cognizant of what is out there, through social media and Twitter and Instagram. So they're more careful in what they say. So, their message has changed. And so getting information from a prospect, is a greater challenge. And so you kind of have to work around that in how you gather your information, whom you gather it from, and then also trying to juggle it. That to the nth degree now, there are, various prospects, and there's a great range here, so I'm not saying all or few, but they know how to play a game. The coaching staffs are being told something by a prospect, and there's no guarantee they're being told the truth. Certain schools might get played in the process. And so kind of sifting through that, as well as just making judgment calls from my end on what is real, what do you kind of have to hedge on. I think that, I think you have to be a lot more discerning with the information. And I think you also have to be more careful with it, knowing it's going to be publicly consumed, knowing all the other schools and suitors are reading it, and just kind of, differentiating, what is what we know versus, okay, here's our read on things. And there's a lot more of having to read things now based on what you're able to gather.
One of the things 10 years ago that a prominent Rivals website like Tiger Illustrated could offer a prospect is a very visible platform by which to announce a commitment, to get that news out there. Well, now, of course, all these players have their own platforms on social media. How much more rare is it now for a prospect to, I guess, give that information to a reporter as opposed to just announcing it himself?
I think you very, very rarely see it. And in the times you do, usually it's frankly been not literally sold financially, but, someone has leverage with the kid. Hey, we were here first, and convinced him, that, hey, whether it's we were here first, would you mind letting us, whether you have a great relationship, but more likely what has happened is, somebody's guilted the kid into, hey, we were here first, and we see cases of this several times before of, hey, we made you a star, all this, you owe us, it hasn't been put like that, but that's the way that's generally the reason of, hey, you need to let us break the story because of it. But it's very rare now. And generally, I think you see, just based on, personnel changes within our industry, what, now it's largely kids announced by social media. Maybe you've got quotes in advance that you will put out as soon as that kid announces. But I think largely we've recognized that the industry has allowed the kid to make that announcement, and we kind of follow suit with reaction quotes, things like that. Again, I think it's also changed, what our goal is as an industry. We're not going to be the ones who are breaking the commitment, and even if we were, there's really no business value in that, because with social media, it spreads so quickly that being the first to commit, being the first to announce it, it isn't a big deal, nor should it be. It's more of, our build up to that commitment as well as the follow up from that is really kind of where we can differentiate ourselves and get the reader.
You grew up in Statesville, North Carolina, right?
Between Hickory and Statesville, closed at Claremont, Hickory. Statesville was my first newspaper job out of college.
Okay. Do you remember, when you first thought, you know what, I think I might want to be a sports writer when I grow up, and then B, when you started taking a particular interest in this crazy recruiting game?
Well, I think growing up, my brother Brett is 4 years younger than me, and he was a sports writer for a long time before he got into the sports information side at App State. But he and I would wake up, and it would almost be a battle to who got to the sports page in the morning. This is middle school, high school years, and I just loved reading the Agate page and standings and box scores. Particularly basketball box scores. I was a basketball guy growing up. So there just generally is where newspapers and sports combined for me. And as I got into college and started thinking, well, what can I possibly do for a living? That's where, I went from, in my mind, maybe sports marketing to, hey, this is kind of my passion, what I love to do. I might as well, pursue this. So probably sophomore, junior year of college is when I made that move. But in general, recruiting, I got back even to high school where well before fantasy sports came into play, there was, a couple of friends and me, I would oversee a group where we'd pick NBA players, 5 or 6, and we'd do our own little fantasy deal per week. And I would kind of calculate by points and all kind of nerdy stuff like that. Just to desire the enjoyment of playing GM and putting rosters and putting teams together. And so once I got to college, I kind of fell for Vince Carter was really the first recruitment that captivated me. And I went to Chapel Hill, and people know that. So that one caught my attention. And I think from there, I started following recruiting some, and just generally the interest in, and this applied to all of sports journalism, what goes on behind the curtain. How it all comes together led me to, once I started covering college teams there a little bit and then got out into our profession, just the fascination with, when I'm going to the high school football games, who's going to be the next guy? How does he project? How does this high school kid project to the next level? Seeing some of those high school stars and following that within the state. I think it just kind of mushroomed from there.
Got to Spartanburg for the Herald Journal in 99, was it?
In 2000.
2000, okay. I got to the Augusta paper in 99, so you were, I guess, a little bit after that. We were both covering South Carolina. You were covering South Carolina primarily. I was also covering Georgia and some Clemson and some Georgia Tech. But, man, it's just crazy how much has changed. Like, back then, I mean, the newspapers were the dominant presence, not only in South Carolina, but everywhere. And I guess something topical just yesterday, unfortunately, news breaks that Phil Kornblut and his sports talk show, not just the sports talk, but the entire South Carolina radio network, like 10 people, including news reporters who were covering the State House and such, Learfield just came in and said they were done. And just curious to get your thoughts on sort of how much has changed over the last 18 years, and that, I mean, newspapers obviously are struggling. Everybody knows that. But you also have somebody like Kornblut who, 30 plus years as an institution, who used to be the presence when it came to, or the only presence when it came to covering recruiting. Now just kind of this is not denigrating his show, but it's kind of more like a dinosaur in terms of compared to how most people consume their and deliver their recruiting coverage. Do you have any? Well, that's a long-winded question. It's more of a statement than anything, but just curious for your perspective on that.
I think it's interesting, particularly as I have a 14-year-old son, and who knows what career track he's going down, but he shows some of the similar interests that I have. But he's largely addicted to sports and has started almost like creating his own little fan sites with Atlanta United and different teams and writing and whatnot. And in one respect, it's a compliment, and I think it's neat to see him do. On the other hand, it's you want to say, whoa, son, stay away. Don't do this to yourself. People, I'm sure you get asked all the time too on, advice for the young journalist, the aspiring, what to do. And a lot smarter people have come up with a lot better advice for me than me, because I look at it and I don't know what direction I would tell people to go, because it is changing so quickly. And there are mediums, I particularly think of the medium of writing, where I really don't know what advice I would give people, because the number of paying jobs and decent paying jobs for people who can write and tell a good story and report, they're going drastically down. It's a challenge to get people to pay for content and all the things inherent with why different mediums are struggling. And you see video and different other components, some degree, taking off. But I think that's I think as we look at going forward, things do change so quickly that it is hard to really plan and look big picture for, what's it going to look like in another 10 years, our industry, and just in general, the journalism, sports journalism industry. So, yeah, my take is more doom and gloom, but I don't, you feel bad for someone, whether I agree or disagree with everything Phil Kornbluth's done during his career. Certainly he was a pioneer in-state for recruiting coverage. And he's certainly, I believe, to be a hard worker. And so to see something like that go down, you do feel sympathy, for particularly someone that advanced in his career, when things like that just can change on a dime.
So I guess it was the year 2001, maybe, when we both, or maybe it was 2000, your first year, when we both went to Williamston and camped out to do in-depth story on one Derek Watson, and that was,
man, that's a blast from the past.
What do you remember from that? Or actually, what the heck is he up to now? Is he in jail?
That I don't know. I know there have been some rumblings on different things that he's up to, but I periodically drive through there, going to, I was there through there last week. And so it's, what comes to mind is, when I'll pass a field that I remember passing back then, or there's a neighborhood, the stories, and certainly, a guy like Derek Watson, there reaches a point where you have to be accountable for your behavior, and you've got to, right and wrong. And so it's not by any stretch to pull him off the hook. But I remember going to the home where he had lived at one point there in Williamston, and there was a kind of a building behind it. And I was talking to a neighbor there, and just, I don't even remember if it was on the record for stories or just kind of tales, painting the picture for Watson. And his older brother had basically been banished, kicked out of his own house for stealing out of his own house, and had to go live in the storage shack behind the house. And so just the different visuals you take for the influences and things that someone like that experienced that led and probably contributed to kind of the mistakes that he probably made over the course of his college career, beyond and before. That to me is what largely comes to mind, as well as just, I go back to several interviews and different people there who I've seen, that you probably interviewed as well, who went on, who've had a hand in UNC or USC athletics through a number of different venues, and that I've run into through the years. So that scene largely is probably the best story that comes to mind.
Is there any are there any distinct differences you can draw in having covered both the South Carolina football program and greater athletics department, and then the Clemson football program and athletics department for a long period of time? Any distinct differences between the two and how the operations are run or anything of that sort?
Considering that was a decade ago or longer, I largely believe, certainly there are differences inherent in running a program in Columbia and the different political and financial influences there. And just, it's a different environment, a different vibe than what you deal with at Clemson. I think you can also, when I was covering it, the South Carolina athletics was overseen by Mike McGee. I think certainly Ray Tanner is a different person than Mike McGee. And I think anytime you have a different leader over a program, there's a trickle down effect to, the environment and the culture of what it's like to experience covering that program. So, I hesitate to make any conclusions on what South Carolina is now based on my experiences a decade plus ago. But I do believe and I think as people talk about the environment at Clemson and what we see, whether it's, you call it laid back, certainly from it being a more rural landscape, a slower pace of life. I think there is a more personable I experience a more personable nature covering Clemson, and some of that's probably inherent in Clemson. I think some of that probably reflects on leadership from the top down, going from, really board of trustees on down to the type of people that Clemson attracts and as well as hires, and just the way things are run and known to run over a long period of time. So, yes and no. I think there is more of a, I don't know if country feel is right to it, but a slower pace, a more personable environment that I feel like you get when you deal with Clemson athletics or even Clemson University on a professional basis. But, again, is that to say South Carolina isn't personable or that there aren't good people working there? No, I would not draw that parallel.
All right. We have to share the story from back in 2005 when a new South Carolina coach named Steve Spurrier came up to Spartanburg to speak at a rubber chicken dinner. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think you wrote something like, you just observed that you were covering it, and you observed that he, while Lou Holtz, would stick around and kiss babies and all that at those events, that Spurrier was out of there lickety split. You want to take over from there?
To be honest, my true recollection there has more to do with writing a column at that time about Willie Corn and his fit, and what, and just generally recruiting and quarterbacks and personalities. And, I'm at that time, I think maybe, I've got 5 kids now, but my oldest son was very young. And my wife worked at the newspaper. And so I'm home with the son one night, and I'm bathing him, and my phone rings, and it's Steve Spurrier, which is pretty uncharacteristic, particularly if you're the lowly, the South Carolina beat writer for the Spartanburg paper, And so at some point you got to take Steve Spurrier's phone call if he's calling you, and you're going through my mind, what in the world is this guy? Why is he calling? Well, he took some umbrage with one or two things that I wrote in the column, and I don't, I'm generally a pretty non-confrontational type writer, but he spoke his piece there, and wanted to make sure knew he wasn't mad at me, but just had wanted to make a point about a couple things, and then just moved on his way, which is it's just fascinating to see, one, how much Steve Spurrier always truly was in tune with what the media said about him, but also there's a sensitivity to what was written, and if anything, as a young writer, it was just kind of neat that, hey, Steve Spurrier called me out of the blue, But that's not something that Lou Holtz or any Clemson coach has ever necessarily called and just kind of taken umbrage there. With something that was pretty, by all intents and purposes, was just should have been a blip on his radar.
Yeah, the story I've always recalled and shared with others is him leaving you the voicemail. I got no problem. I just don't want you making me look like an a-hole.
Yeah. Probably that too. Yes.
Since you brought up Willie Corn, just curious. Clemson has a very highly touted quarterback on the roster right now in Trevor Lawrence, and has had plenty in recent years. I'm just wondering your, I guess, very distant post-mortem on Willie Corn, who was very highly regarded and one of the most prominent, I guess, high school celebrities in the history of the Palmetto State. Was it his? I guess he hurt his shoulder at some point. I guess after he. Anyway, my timeline is all messed up, but I'm just wondering what your.
I think there was just a bunch of factors involved there that all kind of add up. From one, certainly expectations exceeded what reality, potentially even could have been. I thought Willie Corn, from what I saw in high school, could be a really good college quarterback. Did not have pro skill set. He was not going to beat you with a cannon arm, but I think at that time I compared him to, a lot of guys like USF at that time had a really good, and I can't remember his name, but a quarterback who didn't have a big arm, but system guy who could distribute. He was athletic, could run. You could do some different things with him. I think he certainly fits in today's offensive skill set much better than he would have in the Rob Spence skill set for a quarterback. Someone who could use his feet. I mean, yeah, he wasn't going to, beat you with the 50-yard bomb, but there's enough touch there that you can pass down the field and it not be a problem. He's not making the throws that Trevor's making, or maybe even that Deshaun made, but he could do everything he needed to be a winning college quarterback, and a good college quarterback. Not great, but a good one on a very good team. And so I think expectations, because he was an in-state guy, so much hype early on, very prominent high school program, and a very likable guy, I think the expectations exceeded what they should have been. So then you factor in, the expectations for very early in his career for him to be the guy. And very early he hurts the shoulder, and whether they're, I think for one, I think the injury played a part. A hand, that wasn't the total reason, but I think you can point to that as a reason he didn't ever live up to the expectation. But the injury, as well as medically, was he ever the same? Perhaps not. Expectations were so high early, and I think when those weren't met early, I think people around him also, started pointing fingers and, all right, it's Clemson's fault. And so I just think in general a bad. Every little throw he made was analyzed. There was so much pressure on him that I think in general it just became a toxic situation for him to be in. So I think there were, one, would he ever have reached the potential that people expected him to? I think probably not. I think there are just a number of factors that led to that not being, that led to Corn not having the career anywhere close to the career that people thought he could or expected him to coming out of high school.
Business owners in the upstate and beyond, I want to tell you about Tandem Payment, based right here in the upstate, changing the face of payment processing. Office is located throughout the Southeast. One of the owners of the Greenville location, 2005 Clemson grad. If you're a business owner, you know how painful it is to get the weekly phone calls from the national processing companies promising, quote, the lowest rates in the industry. Tandem approaches this part of it completely differently, face-to-face. The newest program they offer is called Cash Discount. You can eliminate up to 100% of your annual credit card processing fees. The best part of it is it encourages more cash transactions inside your business. Plus, you save the typical processing fees you pay annually. Call Tandem today to learn more about how to eliminate your credit card processing fees. 864-672-1570. That's 1570 or tandempayment.com. I'm not sure what you thought of the Dabo hire when he was promoted in October of 2008, but just fast forwarding years later, do you remember when you first sort of thought to yourself, wow, this guy could take them to places they'd never been, or I guess at the very least take them back to simple national prominence?
I don't know when. Maybe when they beat LSU might have been the first time that I thought, okay, they can go. This program can go higher than where I thought it probably would go. At no point for the longest time did I think they were going to be a national championship caliber type program. I thought they could compete and maybe win the ACC, but I didn't foresee them being able to recruit at a level that would make them competitive with Alabama, or much less LSU and some of the other teams at the highest end of the recruiting echelon. I just didn't think that consistently you could beat Florida State in recruiting with the inherent advantages that Florida State should have. So I think once they starting to accumulate some wins against SEC programs, I think is really when it all started to change, and when you can start when you're beating the SEC teams, then you're starting to beat the SEC teams for those recruits on a more consistent basis. Because the best prospects are in the backyards of Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Auburn. They just don't have that. Clemson does not have that advantage. And so when you're able to start go in and get guys that those schools want out of their state, that's really when this thing went to another level, in my opinion. And probably when I started going, hey, this can go to another level. But you bring up a fascinating thing I was thinking about the other day. Just think about when Dabo was hired, what the perception of him was. Not even just from the fan base and going, how can you hire a receivers coach, but within the coaching industry. I mean, there are very prominent coaches out there who behind the scenes were, I think to Paul Johnson, who now is very complimentary of Dabo, but I think it was pretty well known back then that a lot of guys didn't think very highly of Dabo's coaching acumen, because back then we viewed head coaches as, all right, he's basically the next step from coordinator. He's an X's and O's guy who has a very strong acumen on one side of the ball. And that wasn't his resume. But what we've seen is, whether that was underestimated, but combined with, hey, the head coaching job is requires much different responsibilities than what a coordinator has. And seeing kind of how he's put it all together, just how the image of Dabo has changed, and the definition of what we view out of a head coach has changed.
Yeah, and you talking about sort of that landmark win over LSU back in 2012. I mean, the conversation back then about Clemson, it wasn't just, boy, how can they, get to the level of Alabama or LSU or Georgia? How are they going to be able to compete with them in recruiting? It was also, how are they going to keep up with South Carolina? Because the revenue disparity was regarded as such a big deal. The SEC's TV revenues were just dwarfing the ACC's, and of course that, inspired or provoked a lot of the desire to get the heck out of the ACC and go to the Big 12 or beg the SEC to get in. And so that's another really extraordinary and remarkable element of this, is that, Clemson has a pretty good donor base, but boy, when you look at the teams whose tails they're whipping on the field, they're fighting above their weight class, not just against Alabama and Ohio State and others, but heck, the team down in Columbia is bringing in more money, at least from the TV distribution of the SEC.
Mm-hmm. And you wonder to some degree. I think all the SEC teams at that time had the money, or were going to be getting the money. But if you're still, if everyone in the conference is getting that money, it doesn't make all those teams good. You're still gonna have teams that are 6-6, 7-5, or worse. It really doesn't differentiate those schools from one another. And so even if you've got, just even take South Carolina out of the equation, but Mississippi State, Vanderbilt, some of those schools that are bringing in much more money than a number of their ACC peers, does that make them any more? Does a nicer facility or however they use that extra revenue make them more appealing than a team that's going to be 10-2 or 9-3 at that time? I think what we saw was that it didn't, so as much as I think we anticipated that being a story, but like you said, that was a very interesting dynamic that never actually took shape into the problem that everyone anticipated.
Well, I guess just goes to show that if you're spending that extra money on coaches' buyouts after you're firing a succession of coaches, and Florida comes to mind here, and you're buying out coaches every 4 years, then what does it really mean? And so it just gets back to the fundamental principle of it's still about hiring the right people.
Mm-hmm. And money raises expectations, and it leads to the quicker turnover, and maybe it contributed to the instability there for a number of the SEC programs. So, and kind of what you said about who you hire makes such a difference when you look at what has differentiated Dabo Swinney. The culture change. I was thinking about this earlier on just what it took to go from Tommy Bowden, who I believe was a very good person and espoused a lot of favorable virtues for your program, but generally, had the body language when things got looking bad, that you had reason to feel like Clemson was going to choke away that game. The challenge that Dabo Swinney faced in just empowering the team, not through his body language and his words, but also with the people he hired and put in place over time. I think his ability to hire the right people, not only from assistant coaches, but the support staff that he put in place with the money that you just mentioned, have gone so far as well as the SEC victories.
It's so interesting, when they brought in Tommy Bowden in 99, I guess, I'm sure the average Clemson fan thinks that he or she is getting a clone of Bobby Bowden, the folksy, charismatic leader of a program. And Tommy, just like you said, really good person, but he absolutely was not that. And then the irony that the perfect person, the exact opposite of that, the exact person they needed, the figure they needed was on his staff and was somebody Tommy hired. And it's just, I think I can't take credit for this. I think it was Chris Lowe of ESPN who said there is no better fit of a coach and a program and a culture and a school than Dabo and Clemson.
Mm-hmm. And the comparisons have been made, I think Brad Scott has made that comparison a number of times on how Dabo is so much like Bobby Bowden. And I think there are a lot of parallels to be drawn there. All
right. Your Monday morning recruiting insider, you do that on Sundays. What's the process for that? Like, is that an all-day thing?
Oh boy, that is while in my head, I'm chewing on ideas throughout the week, and you try and file some things away, that perhaps can be put into that for the weekend. That is an all day and sometimes well into the night kind of process for me. If people truly want the behind the curtain there, it's really when I get home from church early afternoon, it's lock myself away in my office, and it's all afternoon, all night. There are times that Chris Ard, our publisher, gets it at 2:30 in the morning, but it's an all-day process. Certainly there's a lot of news gathering there. I'm a deliberate writer and try and be pretty careful with my words, and just generally can be a slow writer at that. But I think, you can start gathering information and trying to, make sure everything's up to date. And next thing you know, it's 7:00 and I've only gotten, 100 out of what usually is about 2,000 to 2,500 words written. So it can end up a lot of sweet tea being consumed, a lot of bad food, but, whatever it takes to kind of keep me awake and alert and not passing out over my laptop.
All right. I'm sure some subscribers would wring my neck if I had you on the phone and didn't ask you about the Justyn Ross, the story of his, how he became a Tiger and the barbecue restaurant and all that. Can you give, I guess, the play-by-play of that day for you? And I mean, I know it's I think people are still bumping that thread from that day.
one of the best things that I've done while at CI, but one of the most memorable, at least. I mean, really, the story would have to start several years earlier. Albert Huggins, coincidentally, his recruitment, he committed really after his senior season. I think it was November, maybe December of that year. Clemson had been in it for a long, long time, and really when I first got into recruiting on the recruiting coverage side was when in his sophomore year, or maybe it was after his freshman year, he camped at Clemson, and so that was a long recruitment for kids to follow, or for the fans to follow. So after his senior season, Georgia had made a bit of a run. South Carolina was still involved, but we had reason to think that Clemson was going to be the choice. And just generally, people think that if me or someone on the Clemson beat is going to the commitment ceremony, that's a pretty good indication, whether we've gotten tipped off or we have a strong reason to believe the kid's going to choose that school. That's not always the case. There are times where there's question or it makes prudent sense to go cover it. But, that's the read that people have of, oh, hey, I'm going to cover this event. Clemson's in good shape. So people are asking about that, and we tend to keep that kind of knowledge. We don't broadcast it because, number one, if we were making that strong a statement, I'm not one that likes to tip the hand. There's no reason for me to spoil a kid's surprise if it makes it that far. As well as, for business purposes, professional purposes, others, have followed TI from well before I was there. TI is kind of the leader in this market for recruiting coverage. When TI says, that the kid, they're going to a commitment announcement or whatever, people are watching TI to get the pulse for a recruitment. Anyway, so. We're not really tipping our hand on going to Albert Huggins. But that day I posted a picture because I like to smoke barbecue and whatnot. And that food is obviously a popular conversation piece on our board, and barbecue restaurants are talked about frequently. Posted a picture of my lunch there in Orangeburg at a local barbecue restaurant. So suddenly, barbecue becomes the cue for, a kid's commitment. This is when Huggins makes his decision. So fast forward that to the Justyn Ross deal. Really, Clemson had thought they could get Justyn Ross done by the fall of his senior season, but Clemson brought him in for an official visit in November there, and thought that they could get things wrapped up there. But Alabama came in and made some convincing arguments with him, and really compelled him to carry his recruitment into December, January. So that gave Clemson some work to do. So you had Alabama thinking it was strongly in it. Clemson thought it was in it, and Ross lives within a half hour from Auburn. Auburn thought they were in it. Auburn's got a lot of connections there at his school, had taken a number of different players from there. Different relationships there should favor Auburn. So all three schools really thought that they were in it. The lead up to there, I had pretty strong reason based on some intel I'd gathered from various sources to think that Clemson was going to be the pick. You go in 98, 99% sure, because in recruiting, you truly never know. Like I mentioned, there are situations where people get played. There are situations where circumstances get changed. And in that high-profile recruitment, and particularly when you're dealing with Alabama and an in-state kid, you don't ever rule out any, that kid signing with Alabama in the very last second. But we had strong reason to believe that Ross was going to pick Clemson, and you're kind of monitoring things in the days leading up to that. No one else seemed to have that picture yet or really have that feel. So feeling pretty good about going down there. So we go, I go down there the night before and had already scoped out and, kind of figured out based on talking to some of my contacts back there or in his area, a high school, the best barbecue spot. And it's kind of, so I go there that night, and it's kind of interesting that I see it's a hole in the wall place, a couple motorcycles maybe parked outside, but there was a poster on the wall there right by the cashier of the local Arena 2 team that had Corey Crawford, the former Clemson defensive end, on it. And I'm thinking, if there's one picture I don't want to put out tomorrow before Justyn Ross commits, it's this. That's not exactly going to be the great sell for Clemson to get the local guy out. I'm crafting in my head just kind of how to write that, all that. And so we put that out around noon that day. I'm trying to remember even how I phrased it, but there was here's this great lunch, a 5-star lunch as I called it. And, clear that ignited everything. But the fun in that is no one, something we have to deal with is, okay, if I report something, it can be put on Twitter immediately and not accredited. Other people can steal it to their site and claim sources. They have sources saying something or just write it word of God. No one else can go and take, the barbecue in Alabama is great and put it on their site or put it on Twitter and say that I let the cat out of the bag. So clearly, the fun in that was, our readers started to say, oh man, Clemson's about to get Justyn Ross. But, an Auburn board posted I don't really know what's going on, but the Clemson folks are excited about this barbecue. So that's where the true fun lies. But even then, I go to the school after I post that, and I'm in there, and it's probably 30 minutes I'm in there for about an hour and a half up till the announcement. And I can see, Gus Malzahn is calling, someone in there frequently, trying to get what's going on. Saban has called, you're sensing, particularly with Malzahn, there's starting to be a panic because Auburn thought they were getting him too. And Auburn's starting to realize, wait a minute, something's not right here this morning. And it took, I don't know that Alabama, I don't think necessarily sensed that, but Auburn did. Auburn, I don't know if he just wasn't communicating with them or what, but they started getting a bad feel and they started panicking. And so, it's interesting to see just kind of that dynamic unfolding as coaches are starting to figure things out and piece things together. But even then, half an hour before the press conference, I'm typing and one of my contacts comes through and is almost, is very upset and says, just kind of whispers to me as the person walks by, you might have wasted your time coming here. or you wasted your time. You might have wasted your time coming here. And so at that point, even I, like, my heart stops and going, oh man, because, it's almost like I'm trying to remember the timing on that, but like there's that feeling of, when you see that Zion Williamson goes to Duke, there's when it didn't play out the way you think it was going to play out based on, all the hard work you put in, you get the feeling like what a coach has to feel on, oh no.
Yeah.
But, so then, that person had walked by and said that. And so there's some doubt cast into my mind even, because like I said, you don't know until you know, particularly in something that high profile. But a little, so I'm sitting there, I'm reaching out to, scrambling, trying to see if I can piece anything together. And it kind of figured that, started to put some details together. But what had truly happened was, Justyn Ross came and was she might have been wearing a tie that was crimson red, or I think it was a tie or something. I believe it was the tie. And someone had commented to him about it. And he had led that person to believe it was going to be Alabama based on the color of what he was wearing. But Ross was just playing a trick on that person, to make them start feeling uncertain. But so really, even until he put that hat on, which he did during the ceremony there, it was televised by ESPN. You don't, until he does it, you just don't know. So that was kind of, that was the roller coaster of that trip for me.
So just curious, you mentioned that Auburn really thought they had him, not necessarily specific to this case, but just in general. How does a player is headed somewhere else, but he is given another school the impression, or somebody around him has given that school the impression that he's actually going there? What are the mechanics of that, the motivations of that? How does that happen? And I mean, if you're comfortable, or if you're not comfortable talking about this specific case and how Auburn thought it was getting Justyn, that's totally fine. I'm just curious, in a general sense, how that typically works.
Oh, I think in a general sense, because I think you see it happen on all sides of the equation, whether it's a kid that Clemson's recruiting or a kid that kid that picks Clemson versus ones who go elsewhere. I think what you see in recruiting is it gets to be so intense for this kid. These are professional. Frankly, they're professional salesmen for their school, and they know all the tricks of the trade. And they know how to apply a vice, and they know that some kids have a hard time telling them no, and so they push against that. So I think kind of one thing that several different things can happen. One, you can have a prospect who, whether he knows or he doesn't know, I mean, he's telling everybody what they want to hear, because it takes the pressure off of him. It takes the heat off him, and particularly in there are a number of recruitments where it's intense. I think of a Clay Webb, the five-star offensive lineman out of Alabama, who just recently picked really Georgia over Clemson or Alabama, depending on your perspective there. But I mean, that is a challenging thing for a kid who lives in Alabama, who is surrounded by Alabama people, to say, no, I'm going somewhere else. And so I think in general, you try and to keep the heat off of you, as not only from the public, but also, I mean, if coaches figure out, let's take the Webb, for example. If Alabama coaches or Auburn coaches figure out that Webb is thinking about going to Georgia or leaning that way, their approach changes versus if they feel like they're in good shape. They can intensify things, whether it's a panic push or the way they go about things changes. And so as the prospect, generally a lot of them just will tell them different things just to, number one, keep the heat off, but also to maintain their surprise. Every high schooler wants the element of surprise, and for people to not know what he's thinking. I mean, that's inherent in any high school kid, whether he's a recruit or not. No one wants their parents to know everything about them, those types of things. So that's a huge part of it. But also, I think, what you find is when, if a kid starts leaning toward a college, I mean, there are college staffs that will put the prospect up to, hey, you need to, don't lie, but, kind of steer people to where, whether it's they think you're coming or whatever it takes, but just placate them. If just to keep the heat off as well as to maintain the surprise and all those things. So, that's the underlining sentiment behind it, and how it goes. But whether it's sparked by the prospect doing it, or family, or high school coaches, or the college staff that he's going to, kind of prodding him along to it. I mean, you can go back to Mike McIntosh when he picked Florida over Clemson. There was strong sentiment that I mean, really, it was who's the UNC coach name who just left? Fedora. Mm-hmm. It was a Larry Fedora versus Dabo Swinney battle, frankly, and that recruitment going back to, I think I was very early 2000s for that receiver out of Florida. Where McIntosh misled Clemson, and it was believed that Fedora had put him up to that. And so Clemson thought they were getting McIntosh, and he picks Florida, and that's probably the last we heard of McIntosh. But that's how those things go, and probably why there wasn't a lot of love and friendship between Larry Fedora and Dabo Swinney during Fedora's UNC tenure.
It's fascinating bringing up McIntosh and Dabo losing out on him. You wonder how much that motivated him in future or recruiting battles thereafter. It made him more determined. And I'm speaking of a particular recruiting battle that resulted in Dabo landing C.J. Spiller when nobody thought, even people on his own staff thought he was crazy. It will be really interesting to get his sort of perspective on, maybe losing out on McIntosh ended up producing a positive dividend in the form of Dabo saying, "I'll be damned if that's going to happen to me ever again." Yeah.
I think what we've seen is the Dabo Swinney doesn't forget things, and that there may one thing that chip on the shoulder is a driving force for Dabo Swinney, and so I don't know that it doesn't push you to do anything more necessarily. I guess in recruiting, if you want a kid, you're going to try and sell them on Clemson, but there are battles that you want to win more than others. And I think we saw that with Spiller, perhaps. I think we're seeing that unfold with, as Clemson and South Carolina start recruiting against each other. There are very few instances they recruit the same guy and are finalists. But I think we see that this cycle with Jordan Birch, guy who I believe will be a 5-star defensive end before it's over with at a Hammond school. I think you're seeing Clemson really go after that one, and you're seeing Muschamp really go after that one. And there isn't a lot of love lost between those staffs.
All right, maybe elaborate a little bit more on that, on the relationship between these two staffs. I mean, even Dabo and Spurrier were going at it in the media, but you had a lot of closeness between a number of those assistants. Dabo and Ellis Johnson were still are tight. Dabo and Lorenzo Ward, a number of the assistants like Danny Pierman and Lorenzo Ward and all that. I'm just saying there was a lot more collegiality then, even under that backdrop of Spurrier and Dabo getting into those spats. But now, boy, it just feels uncomfortable.
Yeah, Oh, it's real, and I think, like you said, part of the element is there aren't nearly the relationships that the assistants have. Going back to past crossing of the paths at various other jobs or schools. But I also think it largely, though, starts at the top. I think there are a couple of new Clemson, South Carolina assistants that I think under other circumstances, if they cross paths in a high school gym or at a school, would hey, how you doing? And I think we both know that the college coaches get along a lot better than fans expect them to, based on what school they represent. But in this instance, I think there is such contentiousness between South Carolina and Clemson, going to the top. I just don't think Will Muschamp respects Dabo Swinney, and I don't think Dabo Swinney respects Will Muschamp, based on things that have been said, whether it's publicly or on the recruiting trail, or just in different private functions, or just how they conduct their business. And I think it trickles down from there on the two. There's just not a lot of love lost there, and I don't think either side spends I don't think Clemson spends a lot of time, talking about it, and so I imagine South Carolina doesn't either. But when they do go head to head, there is some, it's intense when they recruit against each other, and I think it gets a little personal.
Good stuff. Hey, man, when you're people like us on the outside who can write about it and who enjoy friction between two coaching staffs, hey, man, the more the better.
Hey, it's an entertainment industry, and you like to. That's what fuels drama, is conflict.
Well, Paul Strelow, I've taken too much of your time. I'm sure that before long I'm going to get a call from Chris telling me to get the heck off the phone with you so you can go do your job. So I really appreciate all the insight. You do a fantastic job for the website, and I know that the listeners are gonna get a lot out of this conversation.
We'll do it again sometime, Larry. Appreciate it.
Sounds good, Paul. Thanks, bud. All right, thanks to Paul Strelow. Can I use the Paulie Streets nickname? I kind of like it. I don't know if Paul does. I forgot to ask him about that. But anyway, it's a busy time for him, so appreciate him giving us an hour plus of his time. Also, appreciate our sponsors, title sponsor, Parham Smith and Archenhold Law Firm in Greenville. Just sent a couple of koozies to a loyal podcast listener in Charleston a couple days ago. If you're in the Greenville area or in the upstate, you want to drop by their offices at Parham Smith and Archenhold in Greenville and pick one up. I'm sure they'll oblige. Also, Tandem Payment, another great sponsor of ours. Really appreciate their support. Most of all, appreciate all the support from all of you guys. Yous guys. Y'all, whatever you want to say. 85,000 downloads, I believe, in the 6 months of existence. So pretty happy about that and looking forward to more in the future. So stay tuned next week for our next edition, and everybody have a wonderful weekend. Cheers.